By early 1945, the Rhine River stood as Germany's last great natural defensive line in the west. For centuries, the river had functioned as both boundary and shield. Wide, cold, and difficult to cross under fire, it was more than a geographic feature. It was a military obstacle that planners had long considered decisive. Now, as Allied forces advanced toward it from multiple directions, German High Command treated the Rhine as the final barrier that could stabilize a collapsing front. Operational plans assumed layered resistance along its western bank. Units were ordered to establish defensive belts in depth. Infantry formations dug positions overlooking likely crossing sites. Artillery batteries were positioned to dominate bridges and ferry points. Anti-aircraft guns were redeployed to cover approaches from both ground and air. What remained of Germany's armored reserves was placed behind the line, intended for rapid counterattack if a breach occurred. Engineers prepared demolitions in detail. Every major bridge was wired. Charges were calculated and tested. Trigger mechanisms were installed with clear orders: destroy crossings the moment they risked falling intact into Allied hands. Smaller bridges and secondary routes received similar attention. Rail lines were disrupted deliberately to prevent exploitation if forced withdrawals became necessary. Fallback positions were identified east of the river, even if the western bank collapsed. Successive defensive lines were planned to slow any advance to the industrial heartland beyond. The Ruhr region, critical to Germany's remaining war production, lay vulnerable if the Rhine were crossed in strength. High Command understood that once the Allies established bridgeheads across the river, the war inside Germany proper would accelerate dramatically. Confidence, however, rested heavily on geography. The Rhine in many sectors stretched hundreds of meters wide. Winter currents ran strong. The banks, in several areas, were steep and exposed. Amphibious crossings under direct fire were historically costly. German leadership believed that even if the Allies reached the river quickly, forcing a crossing would require time, preparation, and massive coordination. Time was the central calculation. Each day bought at the Rhine meant additional mobilization of reserves. It allowed displaced units to regroup. It provided opportunity to reorganize fragmented formations retreating from the west. Politically, it offered a symbol proof to both the German population and remaining commanders that a defensible line still existed. Orders reflected this belief: hold the West Bank as long as possible, destroy crossings if necessary, delay, disrupt, exhaust the enemy. The Rhine was not viewed as merely another defensive position. It was considered the line upon which negotiations, hope, and survival might depend. If the river held, Germany could prolong the war, perhaps long enough to alter its strategic situation. If it failed, the path into the core of the country would lie open. Yet beneath official confidence, material reality was harsher. Fuel shortages persisted. Replacement troops were younger and less experienced. Air superiority belonged almost entirely to the Allies. Artillery ammunition was limited in many sectors. While the Rhine was formidable, the forces assigned to defend it were no longer those of earlier years. Still, geography remained the final advantage. German commanders calculated that even weakened divisions, positioned correctly behind a powerful natural obstacle, could inflict significant delay. The river itself would do part of the fighting. Cold water, strong currents, and exposed approaches would impose friction on any crossing attempt. The expectation was clear: the Rhine would not fall quickly. It would demand preparation. It would buy Germany time as Allied formations approached its western bank. The river carried more than water. It carried the weight of Germany's final defensive assumption that geographer, even when armies weakened, he could still shape the outcome of war. Whether that assumption would hold depended not only on terrain, but on the speed, coordination, and resolve of the forces advancing toward it. In the final months of the war, German planning depended heavily on timing. High Command estimates projected that major elite formations would require weeks before reaching the Rhine in strength. The assumption was based on distance, damaged infrastructure, and the expectation that supply lines would slow any deep penetration into western Germany. Rivers, destroyed bridges, and winter conditions were believed to impose predictable delays. Those projections proved dangerously optimistic. Reports from the Western Front began indicating accelerated Allied movement, particularly from formations advancing under aggressive operational tempo. Yet initial intelligence assessments treated these movements as temporary surges rather than sustained thrusts. Patton's eastern drive was underestimated. German analysts believed his forces would require extended consolidation before pushing deeper into German territory. Previous offensives had often paused to reorganize supply, integrate replacements, and secure flanks. Cliff's intelligence officers assumed similar patterns would apply again. They did not account for the scale of logistical adaptation that had already taken place. Allied supply networks had improved dramatically since earlier campaigns. Fuel distribution, road repair units, and bridging capabilities allowed armored formations to maintain momentum far longer than German estimates predicted. What appeared from a distance as overextension was, in reality, deliberate operational pressure. Reconnaissance failures compounded the miscalculation. Aerial reconnaissance assets were severely listed, limited by Allied air superiority. Many German aircraft could not operate freely over contested zones. Ground reconnaissance patrols, operating under constant threat, struggled to penetrate rapidly shifting Allied lines. Communication disruptions further delayed accurate reporting. As a result, rapid armored redeployments went partially undetected. Entire columns shifted positions faster than German intelligence cycles could update. By the time reports moved from field observers to operational headquarters, the situation on the ground had already changed. Maps marked with unit positions were often outdated within hours. Field commanders received conflicting assessments. Some reports warned of concentrated armored movement aimed directly toward critical river crossings. Others suggested feints or limited probes designed only to test defenses. Without consistent verification, uncertainty shaped decision-making. Should reserves be committed immediately, or should they be held back in anticipation of a larger assault? Elsewhere, the lack of clarity produced hesitation in several sectors. Forward units were instructed to maintain positions under the assumption that the main Allied effort was still days away. Defensive preparations continued, but without urgency proportional to the actual threat. Demolition teams waited for explicit authorization before destroying key bridges, hoping to preserve mobility as long as possible. Meanwhile, Allied forces advanced faster than anticipated. Speed disrupted the German decision cycle. Each new intelligence update arrived slightly behind reality. By the time analysts recognized the scale of the eastern thrust, armored spearheads were already approaching critical infrastructure. The realization came abruptly. Reports from frontline observers confirmed heavy armor concentrations near key approaches. Communications from exposed units indicated growing pressure. Defensive belts that had been planned as buffer zones were being tested sooner than scheduled. Weeks of expected preparation compressed into days. The miscalculation was not rooted in a single failure, but in compounded assumptions about tempo, logistics, and the ability to track a highly mobile enemy under deteriorating reconnaissance conditions. By the time Clary emerged at higher headquarters, forward formations were already exposed to concentrated attack. Positions designed to delay were now at risk of rapid penetration. Bridges intended to be destroyed at the last possible moment were suddenly in immediate danger. Reserve movements that might have stabilized sectors earlier were now reactive rather than preventive. Intelligence, intended to buy time through foresight, had instead surrendered time through delay. The Rhine was still ahead. Defensive plans were still in place, but the margin for controlled execution was shrinking. What had been envisioned as a measured withdrawal toward a prepared barrier was becoming a race against momentum, one in which information lagged behind movement. And in modern warfare, when speed outpaces intelligence, exposure follows. As Allied formations accelerated their advance, the defensive concept centered on the Rhine began to fracture under pressure. German plans had relied on controlled withdrawal and deliberate demolition. Bridges were to be destroyed at precisely calculated moments, late enough to preserve mobility, early enough to deny the enemy intact crossings. That balance required coordination, clear communication, and accurate timing. Those conditions no longer existed. Patton's forces advanced with a tempo that disrupted preparation cycles. Armored spearheads reached key river approaches before cohesive defensive belts fully formed. Units assigned to hold buffer zones were either bypassed or forced into hasty retreats, compressing the timeline for demolition teams positioned at major crossings. In several sectors, Charges were set, but orders were delayed. Local commanders hesitated, uncertain whether to preserve escape routes for friendly units still withdrawing. Communication lines were strained by air attacks and overloaded. Signals, traffic, authorization, changeload decisions that are required. Immediacy. The result was inconsistency. Some bridges were destroyed too early, isolating retreating elements west of the river. Others were demolished too late or knotted, or allowing Allied forces to secure partial crossings before defenses stabilized. In a confusion, what had been intended as synchronized denial became fragmented reaction. Rear area positions were overtaken in rapid succession. Supply depots, artillery parks, and temporary headquarters located behind the front found themselves exposed as forward lines collapsed faster than anticipated. Defensive depth narrowed sharply. Positions that had been mapped as fallback lines became frontline positions within hours. Command posts began reporting breakthroughs almost simultaneously. Scepter reports arriving at higher headquarters described similar patterns. Rapid armored penetration, infantry following closely behind, artillery fire shifting forward with precision. Attempts to regroup were complicated by the speed of the advance. Units withdrawing to reorganize discovered that adjacent sectors had already fallen back further than expected. Cohesion eroded under compression. The defensive design along key sectors depended on sequential resistance, one line delaying long enough for the next to prepare. Instead, multiple lines were pressured at once. The tempo of the assault prevented orderly consolidation. Artillery units struggled to maintain coordinated fire plans as observation posts were displaced. Engineer detachments tasked with reinforcing riverbanks were forced to abandon worksites under direct threat. Reserve formations moving toward threatened crossings encountered traffic congestion and air interdiction, reducing their ability to counterattack in strength. The psychological effect compounded the operational impact. When reports of lost crossings circulated, confidence in the defensive barrier weakened rapidly. The Rhine had been treated as a stabilizing line, a point at which retreat would end and resistance would harden. As crossings were secured ahead of schedule, that assumption unraveled. Bridges lost meant more than infrastructure lost. They meant the barrier itself was compromised. In key areas, Allied forces established footholds before German units could concentrate sufficient strength to contain them. Once bridgeheads expanded, artillery and additional armor crossed in increasing volume. What might have been isolated penetrations began transforming into sustained breakthroughs. Organized resistance did not disappear immediately, but it fragmented. Instead of coordinated sector-wide defense, resistance became localized and reactive. Small groups fought determined, delaying actions, but without synchronized support. Their efforts could not restore continuity along the line. By the time senior command attempted to re-establish a cohesive defensive framework east of the river, the initiative had shifted decisively. The Rhine, envisioned as a final shield, was no longer a singular obstacle. It had become a contested corridor. Bridges were lost, lines were broken, and the defensive timetable that once promised weeks had collapsed into days. The barrier remained on the map. On the ground, its integrity had already begun to dissolve. The confirmation that Allied forces had secured crossings over the Rhine carried immediate operational consequences, but its psychological impact inside German high command was equally profound. But for months, the Rhine had been treated not merely as terrain, but as a strategic assurance. It represented a final line behind which reorganization could occur, a natural barrier capable of compensating for dwindling manpower and material shortages. Its loss was more than tactical, it was symbolic. Generals studying situation maps began to see the Western Front contracting inward. Colored markers that once stretched across defensive belts west of the river were erased or shifted east. Bridgeheads that were expected to be temporary became expanding zones of Allied consolidation. Reports from multiple sectors indicated simultaneous pressure rather than isolated breaches. The scale of the development became clear quickly. It was not a probing action, it was penetration in strength. Senior commanders acknowledged the psychological weight of losing the Rhine for both the military and civilian population. The river had long represented a protective boundary of the German homeland. Once breached, the war was no longer being fought in contested territories beyond Germany's core. It was unfolding inside it. Orders were issued to stabilize the line east of the river, but orders alone could not create reserves. Armored divisions, previously identified for counterattack, had already been depleted in earlier operations. Replacement units consisted increasingly of inexperienced recruits and improvised formations. Fuel shortages restricted rapid redeployment. Artillery ammunition, once stockpiled in anticipation of defensive battles, had been consumed in prior engagements. Attempts to assemble cohesive counterforces revealed the structural weakness of the remaining military capacity. Commanders were instructed to hold critical urban centers, delay at natural choke points, and prevent encirclement of industrial regions. Yet each directive collided with the same limitation: insufficient manpower and mobility to implement large-scale stabilization. Situation reports grew increasingly urgent. Field headquarters requested reinforcements that could not be delivered. Communications emphasized the speed with which Allied bridgeheads were expanding. Requests for coordinated counteroffensives were reviewed and quietly assessed as unrealistic given available strength. Confidence in holding a continuous defensive line began to fade. Instead of envisioning a stabilized front, planning shifted toward localized resistance and delay. The concept of a solid barrier across the western approaches gave way to fragmented defense around key cities and transportation hubs. Continuity was no longer assumed. Survival of individual sectors became the focus within the command structure. The realization spread gradually but unmistakably. The war in the West was nearing its terminal phase. This recognition did not produce immediate surrender or collapse. Orders continued to be transmitted. Units continued to resist. Defensive preparations continued wherever possible. But the strategic calculus had shifted. The question was no longer how to restore the Western Front to stability, it was how long resistance could be sustained. Maps that once displayed operational planning weeks into the future were replaced with shorter forecasting horizons, measured in days. The initiative had irreversibly passed to the Allies. German command no longer dictated tempo. It reacted to it. The loss of the Rhine accelerated that transition. What had been expected to buy time instead marked the contraction of options. Industrial centers east of the river were now directly threatened. Transportation networks faced disruption from both ground advance and overwhelming air superiority. The ability to regroup at scale diminished with each passing day. Inside command rooms, assessments became more restrained, more sober. The language of counterstroke and stabilization gave way to delay and containment. Even among officers committed to continued resistance, there was growing awareness that geography alone could no longer compensate for material imbalance. The Rhine had fallen as a barrier. With it fell the last widely shared expectation that a single defensive line might alter the outcome. From that point forward, the conflict in the West moved steadily toward conclusion, not through sudden collapse, but through the steady erosion of defensive coherence and strategic possibility. The realization was not announced publicly, but within German command. It was understood: the Western War was entering its final chapter.